Hey guys, tonight's story is about one of the strangest hijackings in aviation history, a 1970 Japan Airlines flight that started as a routine trip to Fukuoka and ended with armed hijackers demanding to be flown to North Korea. On board were 129 passengers, a crew caught in the middle, and a group calling themselves the Red Army faction. No gunfire, no casualties, just a tense standoff in the sky and a landing nobody expected. So before you get comfortable, if you enjoy what I do here, consider liking the video and subscribing. It really helps me keep making these videos, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see you guys tuning in every night. Now, dim the lights, put on some headphones for a more immersive experience, and let's ease into tonight's story together. Tokyo, March 1970. 31,000 feet above the Earth. Japan Airlines Flight 351 sliced through the clouds, settling into its cruising altitude. It had been in the air for barely 10 minutes, lifting off from Tokyo's Haneda Airport with the easy confidence of a routine domestic flight. Fukuoka was just an hour away. The kind of short, uneventful journey, where the seatbelt sign clicks off, the cabin hums with quiet conversation, and passengers turn their attention to books or the view. But this flight would not be routine. It would not be uneventful. On board were 122 passengers, tourists eager to see the southern coast, businessmen with briefcases tucked under their seats, doctors heading to conferences, and clusters of fresh-faced university students on spring break. Among them, a few stood out. An influential Pepsi executive, the bass player of rising rock group Hijacking no Rarizu, and a Roman Catholic priest from New York, his collar stark against his coat. A mix of lives and stories, strangers sharing a single stretch of sky. But above the hum of the engines, fate had already shifted, and in less than an hour every person aboard would be bound together in an ordeal that none of them could have imagined. Around 7:30 a.m., with the sun rising over the southern slopes of Mount Fuji, a young Japanese man rose from his seat. His voice carried over the low drone of the engines as he made an extraordinary announcement. He was hijacking the plane. His name was Takamaro Tamiya, just 27 years old, a recent university graduate. At first, his words didn't send the cabin into chaos. This was 1970, a time when airline hijackings, though alarming, weren't the international crimes they are today. They weren't even strictly illegal in Japan. Concern rippled through the rows, yes, but it was mixed with a strange, almost detached curiosity. That calm would not last. Tamiya reached into his belongings and drew out a weapon that caught the cabin lights. A samurai sword. The long curved blade left no doubt in anyone's mind. He meant every word. In that moment, the tone inside the aircraft shifted. The easy chatter died. Every passenger could feel the weight of steel and intent in the air. And while there were 122 people on board, far too many for one man to control, Tamiya hadn't come alone. Panic swept through the cabin, and then, one by one, Tamiya's accomplices stood up. The so-called university students had shown their faces. It was strange. Many were still in their first years at Tokyo and Kyoto universities, the most elite schools in Japan. One was barely 16, still in high school. They looked young, but they carried themselves with a seriousness that didn't match their age, and they were armed. Like Tamiya, some held samurai swords, others had pistols, and a few clutched crude pipe bombs wrapped in tape. The mix of youth and weapons was unsettling, danger and inexperience bundled together. At the front, the hijackers hammered at the cockpit door, while the shaken pilots radioed for help, sending urgent messages about the unfolding crisis. It felt only a matter of time before the door gave way. Meanwhile, the other students moved through the cabin, tying the male passengers to their seats on Tamiya's orders. It was a strange and disturbing scene. 9 young Japanese hijackers in all, carrying out an act of terror few could have imagined. But the most surprising face among the hijackers was someone passengers already knew, at least from the music scene. He was Moriaki Wakabayashi, the bass player for the rising rock band Hijacking no Rarizu. This was no publicity stunt. He stood there, armed, committed, and just as deep into this as the rest of his comrades. It was time for them to take control. With the cockpit door finally forced open, and the pilots overpowered, the samurai sword hijackers now had complete command of Japan Airlines Flight 351. It's hard to picture airline security being so loose that samurai swords, pistols, and homemade pipe bombs could be carried onto a plane without a second glance. But 1970 was a different time, and the hijackers' plan matched that era. Their goal? To take this aircraft across the Pacific Ocean and into the Caribbean, straight to Havana, Cuba. That was to be their final stop. To them, Cuba was more than just a place on a map. Under revolutionary leader Fidel Castro, it was a communist stronghold and a symbol of defiance. For these 9 men, hijacking a passenger plane out of Tokyo and steering it to Havana would be a dramatic political statement to the world. They were members of the Japanese Red Army faction, a militant communist group determined to topple the Japanese government and the emperor's monarchy. Their aim was to link up with Cuban revolutionaries, receive specialized military training, and return to Japan ready to launch their own war. They claimed it was out of love for their country, that this was the only way forward, but beyond Japan, they hoped this act would spark rebellion across Asia. In truth, their ambitions went even further. They wanted a world revolution, and they were prepared to push it through fear and violence. They had already promised civil war in Tokyo and Osaka, and had taken part in violent street clashes and several small bomb attacks. Now hijackings were the next stage, and these 9 young men were leading the charge. They had been carefully handpicked from radical leftist student movements at top universities in Tokyo and Kyoto, and were prepared to sacrifice everything for the cause. Among them stood Moriaki Wakabayashi, bass player of the rock group Hadaka no Rarizu, once merely a campus band. It may have been their youth, or maybe just plain overconfidence. But it didn't take long for the hijackers to hit their first major problem, one the pilot himself had to explain to them. Their plan to fly all the way to Cuba? Impossible. Japan Airlines Flight 351 was a Boeing 727, a plane built for short and medium routes, quick city-to-city trips, not for crossing the entire Pacific Ocean. This aircraft wasn't made to get anywhere near Havana, no matter how much they wanted it to. The news caught the hijackers completely off guard. They hadn't even considered this. Suddenly they needed a new plan, and fast, but before they could even think of an alternate destination, the pilots gave them more bad news: the fuel situation. The tanks only held enough for the original route to Fukuoka. That was it. Tamiya now had no choice but to improvise. The clock was ticking. If they were going to land in Fukuoka, then fine, they would land in Fukuoka, but they would do it their way. By now, the Japanese Ministry of Transport had been alerted to the hijacking. The job of protecting the passengers fell directly into their hands. Vice Minister Shinjiro Yamamura himself stepped in to oversee the operation, taking charge of the hostage recovery efforts. News of the crisis spread quickly. Television and radio outlets began reporting live, their coverage drawing in millions. This was uncharted territory for Japan. Never before had the nation faced an aeroplane hijacking. The shock was immediate, and the public watched in disbelief. At exactly 9 a.m., Japan Airlines Flight 351 touched down at Fukuoka Airport. On the ground, a massive crowd had gathered. Spectators, journalists, photographers, eager to witness history no matter how grim. Authorities wasted no time. They moved in, surrounding the aircraft from every angle, preparing themselves for what would soon turn into a tense and unpredictable standoff. Inside the aircraft were 129 hostages, 122 passengers and 7 crew members, and the hijackers believed this gave them all the power. Everything now depended on how the negotiations would play out. On the tarmac, Yamamura and the authorities readied themselves. The talks began, tense from the start. For hours, messages were passed back and forth between the two sides. Neither was willing to give ground. Tamiya made his position brutally clear. If his demands weren't met, he would kill every single hostage on board. It was a high-stakes standoff, every minute carrying the risk of disaster. But slowly, progress was made. An agreement was finally reached. The plan was simple. The hijackers would release 23 passengers in exchange for more fuel, enough to take them to the new destination they had in mind. Havana, Cuba was out of the question. It was simply too far. The hijackers needed somewhere closer, and fast. After some discussion, they settled on Pyongyang, North Korea. To the 9 men, this made perfect sense. North Korea was another communist state, ruled by another great revolutionary, Kim Il-sung, grandfather of Kim Jong-un. Flying the plane there would still send a loud political message to the world. In fact, Pyongyang had already been on their radar. Before all this, the city had been seen as a possible base for their planned international revolution. Stopping there now just meant they could do some reconnaissance on the way. Once the dust settled, they'd still find a way to Cuba. Viva la revolution. And so the deal was set. Tamiya got his way, and better yet, the hijackers still had 106 hostages for leverage. The passengers released were women, children, and the elderly. Japan's negotiators ensured the most vulnerable were safe, but the majority still remained in danger. Now it was time to go. With the pilots having never flown to North Korea, and Pyongyang's air control offering no help, officials at Fukuoka Airport handed them a simple map of the Korean peninsula. That would have to be enough. Japan Airlines Flight 35D1 fueled up and took off, bound for the Hermit Kingdom. But not everyone was happy. In Langley, Virginia, the CIA was fuming. They had agents in Japan to help with the rescue of 2 American nationals on board. Herbert Brill, a Pepsi executive, and Father Daniel MacDonald, a Roman Catholic priest from New York. Now, with the plane heading for North Korea, a nation hostile to the outside world, and especially to Americans, things were looking grim. Japan Airlines Flight 351 was now deep into its journey north. It had crossed the Tsushima Strait, passed over the rugged Korean mountains, and was closing in on the DMZ, the Korean demilitarized zone. This 38th parallel was the tense dividing line between North and South Korea. Once they crossed it, there would be no turning back. The trouble was, the pilots were struggling to navigate. They had never flown to Pyongyang before, and Japan had no formal contact with North Korea. That meant no radio calls, no air traffic updates, nothing. In fact, they didn't even know exactly where Pyongyang's airport was. Before leaving Fukuoka, officials had handed over a map to help. But when the pilots unfolded it, they couldn't believe their eyes. It was a simple line drawing straight out of a junior high school textbook. No coordinates, no navigation points, nothing an airline crew could actually use. Helpful? Not in the slightest. Worse still, Pyongyang had no idea a commercial Japanese airliner was heading their way, and the airspace over the DMZ was a deadly no-fly zone. Violators risked being shot down on sight. One mistake, and they could start an international crisis in seconds. The pilots kept trying to call ahead. Pyongyang, Pyongyang, please respond. This is JL Flight 351. Do you read us? Silence. They turned to Tamiya and his men, warning them that continuing could mean the end for everyone on board. But Tamiya wasn't swayed. He insisted they press on, declaring that North Korea would welcome them, and that, if necessary, he would personally recruit Kim Il-sung himself into the Japanese Red Army. The pilots had no other choice. With samurai swords aimed at their necks and no clearance yet from Pyongyang, Japan Airlines Flight 351 crossed into the DMZ. Only seconds later, the clouds broke, and out came North Korean fighter jets. They swooped in close, guns blazing at the airliner. For a tense moment it looked like the end. But just as quickly as it began, the firing stopped. No explosions, no damage. The pilots realized it had been warning fire. Then, faintly through the static, came a voice on the radio. This is Pyongyang. This is Pyongyang. Respond, respond. It was English, spoken with a heavy Korean accent. The pilots, relieved beyond words, jumped on the call, explaining the situation as clearly as they could. To the North Korean controllers, it must have sounded absurd, an armed hijacking, a plane from Japan, and a demand to land in Pyongyang. Still, after some back and forth, they agreed. The passenger jet would be allowed to land, but only under tight escort from the fighter jets flanking them on both sides. The hijackers were thrilled. To them, this was victory, acceptance from their communist brothers. But as the Boeing 727 flew deeper into North Korean airspace, the mood among the passengers and crew was far different. They knew that from this moment on their fate wasn't in the hands of the hijackers anymore. It now belonged to the Hermit Kingdom. At 3:19 p.m., Japan Airlines Flight 351 touched down at Mirim Airport in eastern Pyongyang. Waiting on the tarmac was a swarm of North Korean military personnel, soldiers in full uniform, policemen, and high-ranking officials. But there was more. A surprisingly cheerful crowd of civilians stood behind them, holding bright welcome signs. A choir of schoolgirls sang North Korean greeting songs, their voices carrying across the runway. To the hijackers, they weren't strangers, they were heroes. In their eyes, these men were defectors to the glorious nation. Over the airport loudspeakers came a booming announcement. This is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, presided over by the great leader Kim Il-sung. For those who are fighting against Japanese imperialism, we welcome you. It was a grand, almost theatrical reception, exactly the kind of spectacle the young radicals had dreamed of. But for the hostages, it was something else entirely. The sight and sound of this orchestrated welcome only deepened their unease. A North Korean official soon approached the aircraft, ready to formally receive the foreign arrivals. This was the moment Tamiya and his men had been waiting for. Soon they would be standing on North Korean soil as brothers in the communist cause. Meanwhile, in a nearby hangar, Japanese officials and CIA agents prepared for their move. The plan was simple: lure the 9 hijackers far enough away from the plane, then strike. The man approaching the aircraft wasn't really from Pyongyang. He was part of the trap, because while the hijackers had landed in a Korean capital, it was the wrong one. Back in Fukuoka, Japanese authorities and the CIA had failed to secure the release of all hostages. Negotiations had stalled, and time was running out. But there was no way, absolutely no way, they would allow 106 Japanese and American citizens to be flown straight into the heart of North Korea. The solution? Divert the flight to Seoul. They knew they had only minutes before Flight 351 crossed irreversibly into North Korean airspace. It would take quick thinking and even quicker action. If the hijackers wanted to land in Pyongyang, then fine, let them think they were landing in Pyongyang. But it would be on the authorities' terms. This became Plan B. The first step was to bring the South Koreans into the fold. Pulling this off would require seamless cooperation between 3 nations: Japan, the United States, and South Korea. The hijackers could never suspect it, and the clock was ticking. They had less than an hour. Up in the cockpit, the Japanese pilots were still trying to navigate to Pyongyang, but the map they'd been given was useless, just a crude line drawing from a junior high school textbook. It had no detail, no navigation points. As the captain was about to toss it aside, he noticed a small handwritten note in the corner. No aviation map, but tune into frequency 121.5 megacycles. He followed the instruction. Soon after crossing the DMZ, fighter jets appeared through clouds, unleashing bursts of gunfire. To everyone on board, it looked and sounded like anti-aircraft fire, proof they'd entered North Korean airspace. But in truth, it was South Korean Air Force staging attack to sell the deception. Then over the radio came a voice. "This is Pyongyang. Respond, respond." Spoken in English with a thick Korean accent. But the voice wasn't from Pyongyang. It was an air traffic controller near Seoul. Even today, no one can say for sure how much the pilots knew about the plan. Some believe they were as clueless as the hijackers. Others think they were active players in the ruse from the very start. What is certain is this: after following the directions given over frequency 121.5 megacycles, the pilots steered Flight 351 back across the DMZ and safely landed at Gimpo International Airport in Seoul. And now the mystery of the crude, useless map finally made sense. It was never meant to get them to Pyongyang at all, because the Japanese authorities had never intended for them to go there. The clock was running out. They had only minutes left to sell the illusion. As the aircraft's wheels hit the tarmac, South Korean airport crews were working in overdrive, racing to complete the transformation. Their goal? Make Seoul look like Pyongyang. Anything that revealed they were in South Korea had to go. Signs, logos, and branding were hidden or swapped. South Korean flags came down, replaced by North Korean flags. Police officers dressed in communist-style uniforms, while soldiers wore the olive green of the North Korean military. A group of civilian actors stood ready with hand-painted welcome signs, pretending to be adoring locals. For the finishing touch, a choir of schoolgirls from the area sang North Korean greeting songs, their voices carrying across the airfield. And then came the loudspeakers blasting across the runway. This is the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, presided by the great leader Kim Il-sung. For those who are fighting against Japanese imperialism, we welcome you. It wasn't perfect, but it would have to do. A man dressed as a North Korean official stepped forward, lifting a megaphone to his mouth. "We have prepared a shuttle bus to take you, the revolutionary heroes, to meet the great leader and premier Kim Il-sung," he announced. Off to the side, hidden from view, the real power players were in place. Japanese, American, and South Korean authorities stood ready, each waiting for the moment to strike. Vice Minister Yamamura was there too, watching closely, every move calculated. The ramp stairs rolled into place, locking onto the side of the aircraft. Inside, the hijackers prepared to step out into what they believed was the capital of their communist allies. They were elated. After giving up everything for their cause, this was the payoff. the grand arrival, the recognition, the validation they craved. In their minds, this was history in the making. One by one, they headed for the door, soaking in the moment. But they didn't realize the real fight was just beginning. One by one, the hijackers stepped onto the stairway, their faces lit with the pride of men who believed they had just made history. The air was brisk, the kind that bites a little at your cheeks, but they barely noticed. To them, this was Pyongyang, the promised land. The stairway clanged softly under their boots, every step bringing them closer to what they thought would be an embrace from their North Korean comrades. From the top of the stairs, they could see the scene laid out before them, rows of soldiers in dark olive uniforms, the Red Star flag snapping in the breeze, a crowd of cheering civilians waving banners scrawled with slogans of solidarity. Schoolgirls stood neatly in formation, their voices raised in what sounded like revolutionary welcome songs. Everything about it looked authentic, everything felt authentic. And then the first one's feet touched the tarmac. That's when it happened. From beyond the false soldiers and smiling crowds, shadows began to move. Men in plain clothes, moving with the precision of predators, stepped out from behind vehicles and airport equipment. They didn't run, they didn't shout, they just advanced, closing the space with deliberate, measured steps. Within seconds, the hijackers' world shifted from triumph to confusion. The cheering crowd kept clapping, the schoolgirls kept singing. But now the sound was almost drowned out by the thud of boots on concrete, the click of safeties being switched off, and the muffled commands in Korean and Japanese barked by the real soldiers, South Korean commandos. Before the hijackers could fully process what was happening, the plainclothes operatives were on them. Arms were twisted, samurai swords wrenched away, pistols stripped from their hands. The trap had sprung shut. The first few hijackers froze the moment they realized what was happening. Their eyes darted from the unfamiliar faces of the commandos to the schoolgirls still singing in the background. The sound now felt mocking, almost surreal. A couple of them let their weapons drop without a fight, their hands going up in disbelief. They had been outplayed, and deep down they knew it. But not all of them were ready to give in. Two of the more defiant young men tightened their grip on their samurai swords, the steel catching the light as they raised them in a last, desperate show of resistance. They shouted slogans, angry, hollow words about the revolution. But before the blades could swing, the commandos surged forward. Heavy hands slammed down on wrists, the sharp clang of the swords hitting the tarmac echoing through the air. One hijacker reached for the pistol tucked into his belt, but a plainclothes operative was already on him, knocking the weapon aside and shoving him to the ground. Another was dragged backward so fast that his feet left the ground for a moment before he was pinned face down on the cold concrete. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. Meanwhile, at the far side of the plane, the crew and remaining hostages were being moved with urgent precision. South Korean officers hustled them down the stairs, shielding them with their own bodies as they rushed across the tarmac toward waiting buses. The passengers moved quickly, some clutching small bags, others with nothing but the clothes on their backs, faces pale, hands trembling. They hardly dared to look behind them. Within minutes, the chaos was contained. The hijackers, the same young men who had once strutted through the cabin with blades and bombs, were now on their knees, their hands bound, surrounded by a wall of armed men. The cheers had stopped, the singing had stopped. Only the low murmur of orders and the sound of boots on concrete remained. The revolution had ended here, not with a grand victory, but with a swift, crushing silence. It was over almost before anyone on the tarmac had time to process it. In less than 10 minutes, all 9 hijackers were on the ground, disarmed, their wrists bound tight behind their backs. The young men who had strutted through the cabin hours earlier, swords raised, shouting about revolution, now sat slumped in defeat, guarded by a tight ring of commandos. Meanwhile, the passengers and crew were hurried off the plane in small, controlled groups. South Korean officers formed protective walls around them, scanning the perimeter as if expecting another attack. Some passengers clutched one another as they moved, others stared straight ahead, still too stunned to speak. A few of the children cried quietly, their mothers holding them close as they crossed the tarmac toward the safety of waiting buses. Inside the plane, the last of the crew members grabbed whatever personal items they could carry, before stepping down the stairs. Even in the relief of survival, there was a quiet, heavy air, the kind that lingers after a long stretch of fear. Then came the final reveal. Airport workers moved quickly, tearing down the red "Welcome to Pyongyang" banners, and pulling the North Korean flags from their poles. The false signs were stacked in a corner, and the freshly painted boards with communist slogans were ripped away. In their place, the familiar markings of Seoul's Gimpo International Airport began to reappear. The deception was complete, and now so was the truth. Some passengers stopped in their tracks as they realized where they really were. The shock on the hijackers' faces said it all. They had been fooled from start to finish. What they thought was a grand arrival into the arms of their revolutionary allies had been nothing more than an elaborate stage set, dismantled piece by piece in front of them. The standoff was done. No one else would be hurt. And while the day had ended without the bloodbath many feared, the scene on the tarmac made one thing clear. This was a victory not of force alone, but of deception, timing, and sheer nerve. The 9 captured hijackers were led away from the tarmac in separate groups, each surrounded by armed guards. Their heads were lowered now, the swagger gone. The samurai swords, pistols, and pipe bombs that had once made them seem so dangerous were laid out on a nearby table, silent reminders of how quickly the tide had turned. They were driven in armored vehicles to a secure facility on the outskirts of Seoul where the real work began. Inside a windowless interrogation room, the first of the young men was seated at a metal table, hands cuffed, sweat beading on his forehead. Across from him sat a pair of South Korean intelligence officers, their questions clipped and relentless. Who planned the hijacking? How did you smuggle the weapons on board? What were your orders once you reached Cuba? Some of the hijackers stayed silent at first, their eyes fixed on the floor. Others lashed out with defiant slogans about revolution and overthrowing imperialism. But as the hours turned into days, the bravado began to crack. Exhaustion and the weight of failure pressed down on them. They were told in no uncertain terms that they had never been anywhere near Pyongyang, that their grand political mission had ended in a South Korean airport dressed up like a film set. Japanese intelligence officials soon joined the sessions, cross-checking the South Koreans' findings. Every detail was recorded. The planning meetings in student apartments, the political speeches given late into the night, the stolen money used to buy weapons. The Americans, too, had a vested interest. Their citizens had been among the hostages, and CIA agents quietly sat in on certain interviews, listening more than they spoke. For the hijackers, the dream was gone. The imagined handshake with Kim Il-sung would never come. Instead, they faced the cold certainty of trials, prison cells, and long years of confinement. Their names would be remembered, but not as heroes. Back in Japan, the news spread quickly. Families of the passengers rejoiced at their safe return, while television screens replayed the bizarre details of the Seoul deception. And for those who had been on board Flight 351, the memory would never fade. The moment when a hijacking meant for glory collapsed into humiliation under the bright lights of a very different airport. When the story finally broke in full, it didn't just make headlines in Japan, it went everywhere. Newspapers from London to New York splashed it across their front pages. "Hijackers fooled into landing in Seoul," read one bold headline, while another called it the most audacious counter-hijacking in history. Radio stations replayed the crackly recordings of the fake Pyongyang messages, while TV anchors marveled at the sheer nerve of disguising an entire airport in a matter of hours. In Japan, the public reacted with a mixture of relief and disbelief. Families of the hostages wept openly on television as they were reunited with loved ones, while talk shows picked apart every detail of the sting operation. The Japanese Red Army faction, once held up by their supporters as bold revolutionaries, suddenly looked foolish, duped by schoolgirls singing fake North Korean welcome songs and South Korean policemen in borrowed uniforms. For a group that prided itself on discipline and strategy, it was a humiliating blow. In South Korea, the operation became a point of national pride. Officials praised the seamless cooperation between Seoul, Tokyo, and Washington. Military planners lauded the speed at which Gimpo Airport had been transformed into a convincing Pyongyang. Photographs emerged showing workers painting over signage, hanging North Korean flags, and hurriedly constructing makeshift backdrops to sell the illusion. The United States intelligence community was just as interested. Behind closed doors at Langley, the CIA dissected the operation step by step, studying it as a model for future counter-hijacking tactics. They called it a perfect example of psychological warfare, defeating an enemy not through force alone, but by making them believe a false reality. Academics and security experts wrote about it in journals, citing it as proof that fast thinking and deception could succeed where brute force might fail. Conferences were held, and military schools added it to their case study programs. The The sole deception became a permanent entry in the global playbook for crisis management. But perhaps the biggest impact was psychological. For the Japanese Red Army faction, the loss wasn't just about failing their mission, it was about being outsmarted. And for the public, it was a reminder that even in a world of violence and high-stakes terror, brains could sometimes beat bullets. The hijacking of Japan Airlines Flight 351 may have ended in humiliation for the 9 young radicals, but its ripple effects were felt for decades. In Japan, the incident was a wake-up call. Airport security, which had once been almost casual, was overhauled from the ground up. No longer could passengers stroll onto planes with samurai swords, pistols, or homemade bombs hidden in their luggage. Metal detectors became standard, luggage was checked more thoroughly, and background screening for passengers and airport staff was strengthened. It also pushed Japan to think internationally about safety in the skies. For the first time, Tokyo began to form detailed agreements with other countries for handling hijackings, sharing intelligence, and coordinating military or police action in real time. This included closer cooperation with both the United States and South Korea, an unlikely diplomatic gain born out of chaos. Airlines across the world quietly studied the sole deception as a model. Aviation conferences featured panels on the operation, and counter-terrorism manuals referenced the case by name. The story became a teaching tool, proof that not every hijacking had to end in tragedy if quick thinking, deception and teamwork were in place. As for the 122 passengers and 7 crew members, they carried the memory of that strange, tense day for the rest of their lives. Some later spoke in interviews about the fear, the confusion, and the surreal moment when they discovered that Pyongyang was, in fact, Seoul. A few said they felt like they had been unwilling actors in a spy movie, one with a bizarre twist ending. For the Japanese Red Army faction, the hijacking became a stain on their reputation. Instead of sparking a revolution, they were remembered as the group that was tricked by painted flags, borrowed uniforms, and a choir of schoolgirls. And for the broader public, the case stood as a reminder that even in a world where violence could erupt in an instant, preparation and cleverness could turn the tide. Flight 351 never made it to Cuba. It never even crossed into North Korea, but it changed the way Japan and much of the world thought about keeping the skies safe. The hijackers of Flight 351 took over a plane to chase their wild ambitions. But halfway across the world, one man didn't need weapons or hostages to pull off something just as unbelievable. He sold an airport that didn't even exist. $242 million. It's the kind of number that doesn't even feel real. Most of us get spam emails now and then. Nigeria especially is famous for a certain kind of scam. An email from a supposed prince, or a doctor, or maybe a bank manager. The message says there's a huge sum of money waiting, and they just need your help to move it into the country. In return, they promise you a generous share. Millions, maybe more. The only catch? You first have to send a small payment to verify your bank account before the fortune can arrive. It's one of the classics, a scam almost as old as email itself. But the one we're about to look at today happened before the internet era even began. Back then, the email fraudsters we know today would have looked like amateurs compared to the man at the center of this story, the Nigerian king of swindlers who once sold a fake airport for $242 million. In 1995, the manager of Brazil's Moro SD Bank got a call from Nigeria. This wasn't just anyone on the line, it was the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. The central bank is the top financial authority in the country. It oversees every other bank and sets the nation's financial policies. The governor's position carries the weight of a minister, one of the highest offices in government. So when the director of the Moro SD Bank heard that voice on the other end, he knew this wasn't a casual conversation. The matter had to be serious. The topic, without a doubt, important. The governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria began to speak, his tone steady and deliberate. He explained that Nigeria was preparing to build a brand new airport in Abuja, the country's capital. Abuja, he said, was one of the largest and busiest cities in Nigeria, filled with people and activity. Naturally, if an airport were to be built there, it would draw enormous traffic from day one. At that moment, the director of the Brazilian bank felt his interest rise. He adjusted in his seat, holding the phone a little closer. The governor continued. Nigeria was actively looking for international investors willing to put money into the airport project, and the total cost was expected to be around $250 million. This was not a closed-door offer. They were presenting this opportunity to several banks around the globe. The way he framed it, the message was obvious. Act quickly, because if your bank doesn't seize the opportunity, another one certainly will. The Brazilian bank manager knew that airports in major cities were among the most profitable ventures in the world. Even a mid-sized airport could bring back its initial investment, in this case, $250 million, in as little as 1 or 2 years. To him, this sounded like the kind of investment opportunity that might never come again. He paused, thinking it over while still holding the phone, weighing the numbers in his mind. Then the governor's voice broke through his thoughts. There was, he said, one more element to the deal, a personal incentive. As the bank's director, he would receive a commission of $10 million for serving as the mediator who made the arrangement possible. The manager's enthusiasm spiked instantly. He had already believed the airport was an excellent investment for the bank, but now, with an extra $10 million in his own pocket, it became irresistible. And in truth, it wasn't even his own money on the line. It was the money of the bank's customers, the depositors who had entrusted their savings to the institution. That fact made him feel far less cautious. After some brief negotiation, the decision was made. "All right," he said, "our bank will take this investment opportunity." And with that, the procedures began. The director of the Brazilian bank had no idea he wasn't speaking to the real governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria. On the other end of the line was a man named Emmanuel Noti. Emmanuel had nothing to do with building an airport. In fact, there was no airport at all. The entire situation, every detail, was a fabrication. So who was this man, and how did he end up orchestrating such an enormous scam? Emmanuel Noti was himself the director of a bank in Nigeria, the Union Bank of Nigeria, a private commercial bank. Not a government institution, not a state bank. He was comfortable enough in life, with respectable wealth and a steady position, but comfort wasn't enough. Emmanuel wanted more, much more. He wanted millions, and so he began thinking, searching for a way to reach that fortune. That's when the idea began to form, an idea bold enough to change his life. He would pretend to be the governor. He would go looking for foreign investments for a grand project, the construction of a new airport in Nigeria's capital. Even though Emmanuel was already a bank manager with a solid reputation, he knew it wasn't enough for a scam of this scale. He needed something bigger, a name that carried unquestionable authority. So he chose to become someone else, the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria, Paul Akuma. The plan had to be sharp, precise, and convincing. Emmanuel pulled together a team of 5 trusted associates, people from his own circle, and began discussing the details of how they would lure a bank into investing in the imaginary Abuja airport. Every member of this group had deep experience in finance and banking. Like Emmanuel, they worked inside the industry, and they knew how banks operated both within Nigeria and abroad. More than that, they held private, insider information about some of the most powerful figures in the country's financial sector. That knowledge gave them an edge, and made it far easier to convincingly step into the identities of those high-ranking individuals. The first step of the plan was simple: reach out to banks around the world. But it had to look official. They began sending faxes to various commercial banks in different countries. Each fax carried a carefully written letter, professional in tone and appearance, and signed by someone named Touristia William. According to the letter, Touristia was the director of the Financial Planning and Budgeting Department at Nigeria's Ministry of Aviation, an important and influential role. In reality, there was no Touristia William. The position was entirely made up. The letter explained that the Ministry of Aviation was seeking investors for a major airport project in Abuja, the capital. It sounded convincing. After all, Abuja had only been declared Nigeria's new capital in 1991, just 4 years earlier, and the government was genuinely investing in projects to develop the city. Each fax was tailored to its recipient. The core story stayed the same, but small details were adjusted depending on the bank and the country it was sent to. One of the faxes found its way to the Brazilian bank Noroeste, addressed directly to its manager, Nelson Sakaguchi. Sakaguchi was of Japanese descent, but lived and worked in Brazil. When he read the document, it appeared to be an official letter from Nigeria's Ministry of Aviation, signed by the ministry's director of the financial department. The contents caught his attention. The bank was already searching for investment opportunities in developing countries, something that made the proposal sound credible. What strengthened that credibility even further was the fact that the fax had been sent from a number belonging to the Nigerian government. This was no accident. Emmanuel and his group, using their deep connections in Nigeria's financial sector, had managed to gain access to a government-owned fax machine. It was the perfect touch to make the pitch look genuine. Believing what he read, Sakaguchi replied, stating that the bank was interested in the project and wanted to know more. That was Emmanuel's cue. Posing as the governor of the central bank, he phoned Sakaguchi directly, and the two men began discussing the supposed airport deal in greater detail. On the call, Sakaguchi was almost convinced. He seemed ready to move forward with the investment. The next step was arranging a meeting. Sakaguchi suggested, "We could meet in Nigeria, or I could host you in Brazil." Emmanuel shook off both ideas. "No, for now we'd like to keep this project confidential. It won't begin for another 4 or 5 years, and we don't want it made public before we start. Better we meet somewhere far from both Nigeria and Brazil." Sakaguchi thought for a moment, then said, "I'll be in London next week." Emmanuel agreed instantly, and the meeting was set. About a week later, Emmanuel and his team began preparing. Every member would take on a role. Emmanuel, naturally, would pose as the governor of the central bank. Another would act as the deputy governor. A third would become a director at the Ministry of Aviation. They were 5 in total, plus the wife of one member, and each was assigned an important title. They prepared thoroughly, creating detailed airport plans, selecting a supposed construction site, and even producing documents for the land where the airport would stand. Then they flew to London, checking into a luxurious 5-star hotel. When Sakaguchi's flight landed, they sent a limousine to collect him and booked him into the hotel's best suite. At the meeting, each member of Emmanuel's team played their assigned role. They introduced themselves as the important figures they were impersonating, and Sakaguchi, Saka, seemed to believe every word. There was no internet, no Google, no instant way to search the governor of the Central Bank of Nigeria and compare photographs. Saka had no way to verify identities in real time. Emmanuel came prepared with documents that looked completely genuine, along with photographs of himself standing beside Nigeria's president and prime minister. It made the entire performance feel real. He laid out the supposed airport plans, the business model, and the location of the land, all of it pure fabrication. And yet, in the middle of the discussion, Emmanuel reminded him, "We want to keep this project confidential. Construction won't begin for another 4 or 5 years. Saka replied, "We will send the money whenever you decide to start the project." But Emmanuel pushed back. "No, we can't wait until construction. All we have now are plans. We need to start hiring companies, bringing in tools and materials. The funding must begin now." For a moment, Saka hesitated. Something felt off. Emmanuel noticed and pressed harder. "If you're not comfortable, there's no problem. We have many investors eager to meet with us. But you were the first to respond, and you were excited from the start. And like I told you on the phone, we'd like to reward you with a $10 million commission for making this deal happen. If you're not interested, we'll approach someone else." Saka didn't want to lose the chance, a profitable investment and a personal reward of $10 million. He said, "Even if I agreed, the bank's management might not approve." Emmanuel countered, "This is for you to resolve. As I said, if your bank isn't ready, many others are." Saka's voice firmed. "No, you can count on me. We are partners in this project. I'll manage everything from now." That was it. Emmanuel knew Sakaguchi was hooked. The promise of the commission had done its work. Saka believed he was dealing with genuine Nigerian officials. The agreement they signed in London was staggering. The bank would invest approximately $242 million in 1995 money. Adjusted for today, that's about $413 million. A truly massive sum. Before the London meeting ended, Emmanuel pressed Sakaguchi to make a move, a transfer of $3 million as a deposit, a sign of good faith and proof of his commitment to the investment. Saka felt the pressure. If he refused, he risked losing the entire deal. Reluctantly, he agreed and paid the down payment, and with that he stepped straight into the trap. Even if doubts crept in later, even if he began to suspect fraud, the first payment would keep him locked in. He would send more, clinging to the hope that it was real. It was a psychological play, and Emmanuel knew it well. For a skilled scammer, this was the most valuable weapon. By securing that $3 million before they left London, Emmanuel had Sakaguchi exactly where he wanted him, under his complete control. From 1995 to 1998, Sakaguchi kept sending Emmanuel millions, payment after payment, for 3 years straight. The incredible part? He never told anyone in the bank's upper management. Not a single word. In fact, he even took deliberate steps to make sure no one, not the executives, not the bank's main shareholders, ever found out. His first move was to keep every transfer under $6 million. Why? Because Saka personally handled all foreign transfers below that amount. Anything higher required board approval, and that would mean questions. The second move was to scatter the transfers across the globe. The money didn't go to one account or one country. It flowed into America, Britain, Switzerland, Hong Kong, each transfer going to a different destination. Even the receiving banks were different. Funds were routed through a web of countries and institutions, making the trail harder to follow, and no one in management bothered tracking where the money was going. That was supposed to be the manager's job. Meanwhile, in Nigeria, Emmanuel and his crew were busy moving the funds. They used a total of 17 banks to mix the money and distribute it without drawing attention. Over those 3 years, Saka sent them a staggering $242 million. To keep him hooked, Emmanuel regularly sent forged documents, photographs, and contracts, all designed to convince Saka that work on the airport project was progressing smoothly, preparing for construction to begin. Every member of Emmanuel's crew came from a banking background. They knew exactly what to do with the cash. They invested in real estate, not just in Nigeria but in other parts of the world. They bought shares in various companies, spreading the wealth across multiple sectors. The whole operation stayed invisible, and it might have remained that way for years, if not for one unexpected twist. The turning point came when a major player entered the picture, Santander Bank, the largest bank in Spain. They wanted to acquire Noroeste Bank. An offer was made, and Noroeste's management gave their initial approval. An acquisition of this size was no small matter. Before anything could be finalized, there had to be a full review of the bank's assets, books, and documents. Everything had to be verified, down to the smallest detail, so the true value of the bank could be determined. A joint board was formed, made up of executives from both the Spanish and Brazilian banks. Their job was to dig into every figure, every record. But what they found was shocking. Roughly 1/3 of Noroeste's capital was gone, hundreds of millions of dollars unaccounted for. The board summoned the bank's manager, Nelson Sakaguchi, demanding an explanation. Under pressure, he admitted that over the past 3 years he had entered into a massive investment deal with the Nigerian government for the construction of an airport in Abuja. He confessed to transferring $242 million without ever informing the board of directors. The reaction was disbelief. Sakaguchi had managed the bank faithfully for 14 years, and now, out of nowhere, he had made the single largest, most suspicious financial decision of his career, entirely in secret. An investigative committee was created. Tracking the money was no easy task. The funds had been sent through a complex network bouncing between countries and banks. But step by step, the trail led them toward Nigeria. There was a problem. Nigeria lacked effective financial oversight. The committee couldn't identify the individuals who had ultimately received the transfers. The investigation dragged on, until pressure from Western banks, especially Swiss institutions, forced Nigerian banks to cooperate. Eventually, Nigerian investigators froze several accounts that had been used to move the money. Swiss banks demanded they reveal the true account holders, fearing their own accounts abroad could be blocked. The Nigerian banks finally named the people behind the scheme, Emmanuel and his crew. But another obstacle quickly appeared. Nigeria had no laws against financial fraud at the time. Emmanuel and his associates remained free, and it was widely suspected they had bribed officials to ensure no one pursued the case on behalf of foreign governments. In the end, the acquisition went ahead. Noroeste was sold to Santander, but at a much lower price than its real value. Sakaguchi's own fate was sealed in Switzerland, where he was tried for financial fraud and money laundering. He was sentenced to several years in prison. The bank's owners didn't simply accept their losses. They hired lawyers in multiple countries, hoping to recover at least some of the stolen fortune. The effort, however, faced a brick wall. Most of the stolen funds and assets were in Nigeria, and the Nigerian government refused to cooperate. The situation remained frozen until a change in leadership. Olusegun Obasanjo became president of Nigeria, and his administration quickly recognized the growing wave of financial fraud cases damaging the country's reputation. In response, the president established a new agency, the Financial Crimes Commission. The Financial Crimes Commission was officially formed in 2003. By 2004, the agency opened a formal investigation into Emmanuel and his crew. The probe led to the arrest of 5 of them. As I've mentioned before, they were 6 in total. The 6th never made it to trial. He died in a car crash during the investigation. But many suspected this was no accident. The theory was that Emmanuel believed the man intended to talk, trading information for a lighter sentence. If so, Emmanuel may have decided to silence him permanently. That remains speculation. The hard fact is that Emmanuel and the remaining 4 were taken into custody, and their trial began in Abuja. From the start, the proceedings were messy. Emmanuel was accused of trying to sway the outcome by stacking the jury. At one session, the judge publicly warned him about bribing jurors and officials. The judge didn't know who had taken money and who hadn't, but the suspicion was there. Seeing control slipping away, the judge ordered the case transferred to Lagos, Nigeria's largest city. Even there, Emmanuel kept trying to work the system. He attempted to bribe senior officers and even reached out to the head of the Financial Crimes Commission himself. That attempt failed, and attempted bribery was added to his list of charges. But Emmanuel wasn't done. In the middle of one hearing, a bomb threat was called in. The courtroom was evacuated, the trial halted for hours while special forces swept the building. No explosives were found. It was a hoax. No proof tied it directly to Emmanuel. But it looked like a desperate move to delay proceedings. Negotiations followed. Prosecutors offered him a reduced sentence in exchange for returning a significant portion of the stolen funds. Emmanuel said he could return 10 million. They refused, demanding 80. He came back with 40, claiming that was all he had. The prosecutor made it clear, "This is your last chance. If you don't return at least $80 million, the reduced sentence is gone." Then came a twist Emmanuel didn't expect. The court called a surprise witness, Nelson Sakaguchi, the former director of Brazil's Noroeste Bank, the man at the center of the transfers. Sakaguchi walked into the courtroom visibly uncomfortable. When Emmanuel saw him, he realized the case had shifted into dangerous territory. On the stand, Sakaguchi laid everything out. He testified that Emmanuel had posed as the governor of the central bank, a major criminal offense, and that Noroeste Bank had sent him $242 million. He presented photographs, letters, and messages backing up every detail. The evidence was crushing. Emmanuel, cornered, tried to return to the earlier offer of 80 million, but now the prosecutor raised the price. Return at least 120 million, plus a fine of over 10 million. With no better option, Emmanuel agreed. In exchange, he received a 5-year sentence, but he didn't serve it all. He was out in less than 2 years. Afterward, he turned the tables, suing the government and claiming they had taken more property than the agreed 120 million. Through the courts, and allegedly through millions in fresh bribes, Emmanuel managed to win and recover around $50 million worth of assets. After the trial and his early release, Emmanuel Nudi lived freely for years. He enjoyed his wealth, kept his properties, and seemed untouchable. But in 2016, his name returned to the headlines. Not for a scam this time, but for murder. The trouble began over a land dispute in one of his regions. Emmanuel allegedly sent around 200 of his men to seize the land and confront its owners. The clash turned violent. A guard was killed, and several police officers were seriously injured. Emmanuel was arrested and charged with conspiracy to commit murder, and yet, knowing his history, few expect him to serve a long sentence. It's far more likely that, even now, he's living comfortably in one of his luxury palaces, surrounded by loyal men. Selling a fake airport took nerve, charm, and not a shred of conscience. But in 1967, a very real plane and a very real pilot met an ending that was anything but a con, and the wreck told the whole story. On Saturday, March 11, 1967, a single-engine Cessna took off from Portland, heading for San Francisco. It was meant to be a short, uneventful trip, just another routine flight. But hours into the journey, the aircraft ran into a freak storm. Within moments, the situation turned dangerous, and the plane went down, smashing into the side of a mountain. Against all odds, everyone on board survived the crash itself. Yet what awaited them in the days and weeks ahead would become one of the longest, harshest survival ordeals the region had ever seen. An ordeal so intense it would ultimately change aviation forever. This is their story. Viewer discretion is advised. Alvin Oyen was the proud owner of a Cessna 1905, an older model, but elegant in its own way. Sleek lines, a bit of classic charm, and none of the boxy look of more modern Cessnas. But for Alvin, the real value wasn't in how it looked, it was in what it let him do. He had a blended family with his wife Phyllis, who had a daughter Carla from a previous marriage. Alvin also had grown sons of his own. One of them, 30-year-old Alvin Jr., was scheduled for a layover in San Francisco, the perfect reason for the family to fly down and see him. After all, what's the point of owning a plane if you don't use it to be with family? At 59, Alvin had lived a life packed with experience. He'd started as a lumberjack, learning survival and navigation in the wilderness, before becoming the owner of the Clifford Hotel in Portland. That business gave him stability, the ability to support his family, and the freedom to enjoy his hobbies, one of which was flying. Alvin was meticulous about his plane, preferring to clean it himself, and even handle much of the maintenance. On this trip he was joined by Phyllis, 44, a nursing graduate from Northwestern University, and Carla, 15, who wasn't thrilled about going. She would have rather spent the weekend with her boyfriend, but her half-brother's busy schedule as a Delta Airlines pilot meant chances to see him were rare. On Saturday, March 11, 1967, they set off for San Francisco. Alvin was a seasoned outdoorsman and a careful pilot, but somehow the family's survival kit didn't make it onto the plane. Maybe it was left behind in the rush to meet Alvin Jr., or maybe it was simply overlooked. At the time, it didn't feel important. The route was short, familiar, one Alvin had flown many times before, but before long that small oversight would become a serious mistake. About halfway through the flight, Alvin made routine radio contact near Medford, Oregon, roughly 5 miles west of the city. The plan was simple: stop in the town of Red Bluff for fuel, then continue the final stretch of their 860-kilometer trip to San Francisco. In the 1960s, navigation for private pilots wasn't nearly as advanced as it is today. GPS didn't exist, but one thing was the same: the use of visual landmarks. Even now, small plane pilots often track highways, rivers, or train lines from above. If you've ever spotted a Cessna flying in perfect parallel to a highway while driving, you've seen this practice in action. Alvin was no different. He relied on his eyes as much as his instruments. But before they could even approach Red Bluff, the weather shifted, fast and without warning. Whatever sense of security Alvin had vanished in moments. A full whiteout blizzard swallowed the plane. Visibility dropped to nothing. The ground disappeared from view. Then ice began to form on the wings, adding weight and drag. Powerful winds pushed them westward, toward the Pacific, stripping away any chance of following the landmarks Alvin had been using, if he could have seen them at all. It's one of the most dangerous situations a civil pilot can face, and accounts for nearly half of all non-commercial plane crashes. The technical term is VFR into IMC, Visual Flight Rules into Instrument Meteorological Conditions. In plain language, it means a pilot who's flying by sight suddenly finds themselves in weather where sight is useless. Alvin wasn't inexperienced, and he would have fought to keep his heading. But with nothing more than a compass and no ground references, he couldn't have known they'd already drifted more than 12 miles, off course and straight into the Trinity Mountains. As the winds roared and ice weighed down the wings, Alvin fought to keep control. Through the blinding storm, a mountain suddenly appeared directly ahead. There was no time to climb, no chance to turn away. He had one option: bring the plane down on the mountainside. In most crashes, that would have meant disaster, but against all odds, Alvin managed a landing that spared every life on board. Skill, instinct, and a stroke of luck kept the Cessna in one piece. They were alive, but stranded, with no idea where they were. Their real ordeal was only beginning. As Alvin unbuckled from the pilot's seat and tried to steady himself, his first instinct may have been to check for the sharp chemical smell of leaking aviation fuel, but something else quickly demanded his attention: the state of his own body. His right side had taken the worst of it: a broken arm, multiple crushed ribs, pain running deep into his spine, a gash to his chin, and 3 more cuts across his forehead. Every breath must have hurt, let alone the effort of crawling around inside a battered, tilted plane. Phyllis was in even worse shape. Her left wrist and ankle were broken, her right hand was cut, and a possible head injury left her foggy and slow to respond. The woman who could have been their best medical asset was now barely able to move. The only real stroke of luck, aside from the miracle of surviving the crash, was Carla. Bruised, shaken, but without broken bones. She could still move freely. That made her essential. On paper, it didn't look hopeless. Alvin had wilderness skills. Phyllis was a trained nurse. Carla could help where they couldn't. Alvin may have cursed himself for leaving the survival kit behind, but perhaps he still believed they could manage. Then came the blow that changed everything. Both radios were destroyed in the crash. There would be no call for help. The Cessna itself was in poor condition, resting on its left side, windows shattered, the top door unable to close against the freezing wind. And without the survival kit, with its food, rifle and flare gun, their odds had just worsened dramatically. Now their only hope was to be found, somewhere on a remote mountainside, in the middle of a blizzard, by people who didn't even know where to start looking. Hours later, when the Cessna failed to arrive in Red Bluff, concern turned to alarm. Calls went out, triggering a full-scale emergency response. The Air Force, Civil Air Patrol and Oregon Pilots Association all joined the search. The weather was no kinder to the searchers than it had been to the stranded family. Rescuers didn't even know where to begin. Somewhere between Medford and Red Bluff, the plane had vanished, a distance of 245 kilometers, or about 152 miles. And that was only the starting problem. They had to factor in how far the Cessna could have been pushed off course. Even a drift of just 20 kilometers would mean combing through roughly 4,900 square kilometers of wilderness. Increase that to 30 kilometers, and the search zone exploded to around 7,350 square kilometers, almost all of it rugged, remote, and unforgiving. It was the kind of terrain that swallowed things whole: dense forests, steep mountains, hidden lakes, valleys without a single road. What no one realized yet was that this was exactly the scale they'd be facing. The Cessna had come down on the north face of Bully Chute Mountain, a full 30 kilometers west of Redding, one of the navigational points along the way to Red Bluff. The mountainside was thick with trees, and snow was falling steadily, burying the wreck deeper with every hour and making it almost impossible to see from above. Back on the mountain, morning came. Phyllis woke with frostbite already forming on her toes. The cold was biting, the wind relentless, and their bodies ached from the crash. By now, they must have realized survival wasn't going to be a matter of hours. It would be a test of endurance. Their supplies were meager: a single picnic's worth of food, a few sandwiches, 3 jars of jelly, lemon drops, 2 bags of M&Ms, some milk of magnesia tablets, a handful of vitamin pills. Not exactly a feast, but better than nothing. They began rationing immediately. To fight the cold, they hung sheets and bits of clothing over the smashed windows. But in a mountain blizzard, keeping them in place was a battle they would have to fight over and over again. In San Francisco, word of the crash reached Alvin Jr. quickly. He'd been expecting to meet his family, and now he knew something had gone terribly wrong. Unlike most relatives in his position, he had the skills and the means to help. He traveled to Redding as fast as he could and volunteered for search duty, joining the aerial missions. It wasn't unfamiliar work. In his time with the US Air Force, Alvin Jr. had flown search and rescue before. It was an almost cruel twist of fate. The stranded family had everything they needed to make survival possible, except for the one thing that could have ended it quickly: a working radio. As the days dragged on, the weather gave no mercy. The storm lingered over the region, and while the clouds sometimes broke for a few hours, a full day of clear skies never came. Search pilots had to work around the weather, darting through temporary breaks or moving to different areas when new storm fronts rolled in. On the 3rd day after the crash, Carla tried to leave the wreck to scout nearby, but the snow was blinding. Zero visibility forced her back, and in the attempt, she lost her shoes. 2 days later, 5 days into their isolation, Alvin had recovered enough to move, but the snow still hadn't let up. By now it was up to his armpits, turning each step into a kind of slow, frozen swim. Staying dry was impossible. Staying warm was worse. Even so, he knew he had to try. Their food was down to the final jar of jelly. If he didn't act, his family would die on that mountain. Bundling himself as best he could, Alvin set off down the mountainside, hoping he'd chosen the right direction. For a short while, Carla and Phyllis could hear him calling back. He shouted updates as he moved, until his voice rang out one last time, saying he'd made it across a gully safely. Then he was gone from earshot, leaving the two alone in the wreck, waiting and hoping. Far above, Alvin Jr. was hoping for the same thing. By then he was part of a massive search: 165 people, 3 ground teams, and 45 aircraft. The odds were brutal, but he refused to stop. Day after day, in cloud and storm, he went back out again. Another week passed. Alvin never returned, and no rescuers found him. At some point during that stretch, Phyllis scribbled a note in the margin of a flight log, Carla's makeshift diary, saying she feared he hadn't made it. By the end of the second week, search crews felt the same. After nearly 600 hours in the air and hundreds of individual flights, they called off the official search. But Alvin Jr. refused to stop. He kept flying mission after mission, even as the storms kept rolling in. His personal search continued, week after week, for a total of 8 long weeks. While the weeks dragged on, Carla and Phyllis found small ways to pass the time. They cut pieces from the plane's upholstery to make playing cards. They kept up the same activities they'd done when Alvin was still there, making lists of foods they wanted to eat, things they wanted to do, gifts they'd like to have, and places they hoped to visit when they finally made it home. But hope is hard to keep alive when you've gone more than a month without real food, melting snow and ice with your own body heat just to drink and fill an empty stomach. On April 30th, nearly 2 months after the crash, Carla wrote in the notebook, "This is my 16th birthday. I hope you're happy, search and rescue. You haven't found us yet." It was dark humor but also sarcasm. In the same entry, her actual birthday wish was simple, that they would be found. And if anyone had earned the right to sarcasm by then, it was her. The notebook itself became a kind of survival record. Carla circled each day on its calendar as it passed, jotting regular notes about the weather. Out of all those days, only 2 were clear and sunny. The rest were storms, clouds, and relentless cold. 4 days later, on May 4th, she wrote what would be the final diary entry. After that, there were no more circles on the calendar. Just one last message, that they were too weak to keep writing, and that they probably only had a little time left. We don't know the exact day they died, only that they did. The blizzard took its toll, leaving their bodies frozen where they had fallen. But the search continued without them. Alvin Jr., still unwilling to quit, flew mission after mission. In total, he searched for 107 days, well beyond the official cutoff. It wasn't until June 26th that he finally stopped. His savings had run too low, and he needed to return to work. Months passed before anyone found the wreck. Then, in the first week of October, a deer hunter named Floyd Bolling stumbled onto it. The Cessna was buried deep in the trees, 5,000 feet up the mountain, in a spot so dense that a search plane could have flown directly overhead and seen nothing, even without the 4 feet of snow now covering the ground. Not far from the fuselage were the scattered bones of 2 bodies, pulled apart by animals. Lying nearby was a book, the FAA flight log Carla had turned into her diary, documenting everything about their time on the mountain. When news reached him, Alvin Jr. returned to Reading. He sold the diary's contents to the Saturday Evening Post, determined to share Carla's story. His 2 brothers joined him, and together they hiked into the woods, camping at the crash site as they searched for their father. Some accounts claim they still hoped he was alive. But from the crash site, it was only 8 miles to the nearest highway. If Alvin had been capable of moving, he likely would have been found long before. Whether this lingering hope was real or just for the sake of the press is hard to say. They found nothing. Eventually, the brothers had to return to their jobs. It wasn't until September 23, 1969, over 2 years later, that 2 more deer hunters made the discovery. Alvin's remains lay heartbreakingly close to salvation. He had made it to within 40 feet of the road, likely following the line of telephone poles that ran beside it. Before he died, he had tried to mark his trail. An arrow made of tree branches pointed toward the crash site. A pair of gloves hung from a tree, intended to catch someone's eye. But no one saw them. As the crow flies, his final resting place was only about a quarter mile, roughly 400 meters from the wreckage. The bitterest twist? It's entirely possible his sons had walked that very field during their search, unknowingly passing within yards of him. 2 years later, all that remained were fragments, scraps of clothing, 2 weathered shoes slowly turning to moss, his glasses, a ballpoint pen from the Clifford Hotel engraved with his name, and, oddly, a camera. Perhaps he had intended to use it to document his route, so rescuers could follow it back to the plane. If any photographs ever survived, no record of them remains. In the aftermath, Alvin Jr. didn't hold back. His criticism of the rescue effort was sharp and direct, disorganized, poorly managed, unprepared. He believed the teams gave up too quickly and that they could and should have been better equipped. At the time, civil aviation wasn't required to carry emergency locator beacons. They were considered optional, costing anywhere from $100 to $300, with the more advanced models priced around $800. Had the Cessna been equipped with one, rescue teams would have found the family within hours. The longest part of the operation would have been the short half-mile walk from the nearest road to the crash site. Carla's diary became the catalyst for change. Colorado Senator Peter Dominic read her story in the newspaper. A former member of the U.S. Air Force, he could easily imagine the agony of searching for his own family, month after month, with no guarantee of success, working with fellow lawmakers including Senator Warren Magnuson of Washington State. Dominic introduced a bill known as Carla's Law. Its purpose to make emergency locator transmitters mandatory in civil aviation, just as they were in commercial aircraft. In December 1970, President Nixon signed Federal Aviation Requirement 91.207 into law. 3 years later, it became mandatory for all civil aviation planes using government-funded airports to carry these emergency beacons. Because of Carla's journal, and the relentless efforts of her family, thousands of people have since been rescued who might otherwise have died, either from untreated injuries or from never being found at all. Her words put a human face on a problem, and in doing so, they helped fix it. We should all be so lucky. The wreckage of Alvin Oyen's plane told a story of tragedy written in twisted metal and broken earth. But in 2016, another kind of wreckage began to spread. One made of stolen secrets, crashed networks, and chaos across the internet. It started with a mysterious group calling themselves the Shadow Brokers, and what they stole was unlike anything the world had ever seen. It's August 13th, 2016. A humid summer night in a quiet Maryland suburb. Most people are scrolling through political headlines about Clinton versus Trump, but online, something far stranger is unfolding. A message appears on GitHub. To the casual viewer, it looks like a prank, a strange stunt from someone desperate for attention. But for a handful of cybersecurity experts, it's an earthquake. The post is written in clumsy English, yet its meaning is impossible to miss. The NSA has been hacked. Not just any part of the NSA, but its most elite cyber operations unit, the Equation Group. These are the architects of Stuxnet and other digital weapons, straight out of a spy thriller. Their tools are not just malware, they are the cyber equivalent of stealth bombers. And now, someone has stolen them. The message comes with proof, files taken directly from NSA servers, cyber weapons capable of penetrating almost any system on Earth. In the months ahead, these leaks will fuel ransomware attacks like WannaCry and NotPetya. Hospitals, banks, and corporations will grind to a halt. Billions will be lost. Lives will hang in the balance. This is the story of the Shadow Brokers, the mysterious group that brought the NSA to its knees with one of the most devastating hacks in history. This is one of those rare stories where the target matters more than the attacker. And in this case, the target was the Equation Group. So who exactly are they? In the cybersecurity world, when investigators uncover a hacking campaign, they rarely know the true identity of the people behind it. Instead, they assign a code name, usually based on the attacker's patterns, tools, or apparent origin. Fancy Bear, for example, is a Russian group tied to military intelligence. Charming Kitten is linked to Iranian espionage. Lazarus Group is connected to North Korea. But when the Russian cybersecurity firm Kaspersky analyzed a particularly advanced strain of malware, they traced it back to an unexpected source, the NSA. And so the NSA's elite hacking unit received its own codename, the Equation Group. The Equation Group is one of the most advanced and best-funded hacking units on Earth. Their fingerprints are on some of the most controversial cyber attacks in history, including Stuxnet, the malware that sabotaged Iran's nuclear program. They have the budget, the expertise, and the patience to spend years developing tools that sound like science fiction, but are frighteningly real. Take Cottonmouth, for example. At first glance, it looks like a regular USB plug, the kind you'd see on a mouse or keyboard, but inside is a tiny surveillance device that can intercept and wirelessly transmit all the data passing through it, from mouse clicks to keystrokes. Then there's Dropout Jeep. Once it's installed on an iPhone, it can pull almost anything from it. Text messages, contacts, voicemails. It can even activate the mic and camera remotely and track the phone's location in real time. One of the most unsettling is RageMaster. This device plugs into a VGA port, the one that connects your computer to a monitor, and wirelessly transmits everything on your screen to someone watching from afar. These are just a few examples from the NSA's arsenal, built with the help of the Equation Group. The full list is long, disturbing, and for the privacy-conscious, terrifying. For many activists and adversaries around the globe, breaching the Equation Group isn't just a technical challenge, it's a symbolic strike at one of the most powerful surveillance forces in the world. Attention government sponsors of cyber warfare and those who profit from it. How much do you pay for enemies' cyber weapons? Not malware you find in networks. We find cyber weapons made by creators of Stuxnet, Doco, Flame. Kaspersky calls it the Equation Group. We hack the Equation Group. We find many Equation Group cyber weapons. You see pictures. We give you some Equation Group files for free. You see, this is good proof, no? You break many things. You find many intrusions. You write many words, but not all. We are auctioning the best files. That was the bizarre opening statement from the shadow brokers, the group claiming responsibility for the hack. The message appeared on GitHub, written in broken English. Whether the awkward language was genuine or a deliberate misdirection to throw investigators off is still up for debate. Stripped of its theatrics, the message was clear. The shadow brokers had hacked the NSA's Equation Group and stolen an enormous cache of cyber weapons. They uploaded the collection online but locked it behind encryption and a password. The full set wouldn't be released. Instead, they would auction it to the highest bidder. Their asking price, 1 million Bitcoin, close to $500 million at the time. To prove they were serious, they posted a sample, a zero-day exploit targeting Cisco and Fortinet firewalls. It worked even on fully patched systems, giving attackers complete control over the firewalls. Within days, both companies confirmed the vulnerabilities were real and rushed out emergency patches. The implication was undeniable: the NSA had actually been hacked. The news spread quickly. The Guardian, The Atlantic, Wired, and the New York Times all picked up the story. This wasn't just another leak, it was seismic. In scale, it rivaled Edward Snowden's revelations, but with one critical difference. Snowden had exposed code names and descriptions of NSA programs, enough to shut many down and force the agency to rebuild. The shadow brokers were releasing the actual source code of the NSA's cyber weapons. Inside US cybersecurity agencies, panic set in. The FBI took the lead in the investigation, now tasked with answering the biggest questions. Who were the shadow brokers? How did they steal these tools? And perhaps most alarming, how many more exploits did they still have? 3 months before Election Day, the timing of the hack couldn't have been worse. The FBI considered 3 main possibilities. First, Russia. At the time, Moscow was already deep into an election disinformation campaign. Just 1 month before the shadow brokers' leak, the Democratic Party, led by Hillary Clinton, had been hacked, with thousands of private emails dumped online. US civilian and military agencies agreed these intrusions came from the highest levels of the Kremlin, designed to influence voters. Maybe this was their work too. Second, an inside job, a rogue NSA insider, another Edward Snowden. Third, perhaps it was simply a crew of gifted hackers looking for a massive payday. The shadow broker's asking price certainly pointed that way. 1 million Bitcoin. FBI Director James B. Comey leaned toward the third theory. The Bureau watched the auction closely. 24 hours in, they monitored the Bitcoin address the shadow brokers had posted. The grand total? Just 1.2 Bitcoin. Less than $1,000. Nowhere near the astronomical sum they wanted. For the shadow brokers, it was a public flop. The FBI allowed itself a brief sense of relief. The good news was that the most sensitive stolen files hadn't been released. At least not yet. Every hour without a public dump was more time to prepare. But there was bad news too. No one knew what the shadow brokers' next move would be. They could drop the files without warning, sell them privately, or disappear entirely. Whatever was coming, the FBI knew one thing: they had to be ready for it, and fast. If what the Russians did is so serious, should there be more retaliation than what the administration has just announced? When the question was, would we respond to the hacking over a month ago, I said some of what we did you will know, and some you will not know, and we've done both. That was then Vice President Joe Biden making a direct and very public threat toward Russia, warning they would pay for hacking the Democratic National Committee and interfering with the upcoming US election. For the White House, Russia was still target number 1. The shadow brokers saw it differently. Inside a conference room, Assistant Attorney General Loretta Lynch sat at the head of the table, flanked by NSA officials, FBI Cyber Division leaders, and members of the National Security Council. In the middle of their discussions, the shadow brokers struck again, dropping a second set of stolen NSA files online. This time they included a mocking, almost taunting message. Why is Dirty Grandpa threatening the CIA cyber war with Russia? Why not threaten NSA or Cyber Command? The CIA is a Cyber B team, yes? Where is Cyber A team? Maybe threatening is not being for external propaganda, maybe is being for internal propaganda. Oldest control trick in the book, yes? Waving flags, blaming problems on external sources, not taking responsibility for failures. Never mind hacking the DNC is way more important than Equation Group's losing capabilities. Amik is not knowing USA cyber capabilities are being screwed. Where is the free press? Is ABC, NBC, CBS, Fox negligent in their duties of informing Americans? Guessing free press is not being free. Free as in free beer or free as in free of government influence. It was part taunt, part political jab, part stream of consciousness rant. And it made one thing clear: the shadow brokers weren't finished. The message began by aiming straight at the White House, mocking Joe Biden by calling him Grandpa, and questioning why the CIA, not the NSA, was leading cyber attacks against Russia. The shadow brokers also turned their fire on the press, accusing it of ignoring the NSA's lost tools. To them, this silence was proof that the media wasn't truly free, but operating under government influence. Buried deeper in the rant was a telling line: "The enemy of my enemy is my friend." It revealed their larger worldview. This wasn't just about money, it was about ideology. They saw themselves as striking at what they believed to be the deep state. And because Russia opposed similar forces, they viewed Putin not as an adversary, but as a kind of ally. Oddly, there was still no mention of their failed million Bitcoin auction. The real headline, however, was the file they posted. This time it wasn't a massive trove of data, but a single zip file containing a detailed list of IP addresses, websites, and domains allegedly used by the NSA to conduct cyber attacks worldwide. Cybersecurity experts quickly verified the list. The IPs were real, and they had indeed been tied to NSA operations. In practice, any organization could take the leaked addresses, compare them with its own network logs, and know instantly whether the NSA had breached their systems. The data wasn't a huge leak in size, but its impact was real. It removed yet another cyber weapon from the NSA's arsenal. By now, the FBI and NSA were stuck. No leads, no evidence, no digital trail to follow. The shadow brokers had covered their tracks flawlessly. It was as if they didn't exist. The investigation was going nowhere, and the clock was running out. The election was just around the corner, and the pressure to find answers was crushing. Inside the bureau, one conclusion began to take shape. This had to be an inside job. Someone within the NSA must be feeding the shadow brokers their information. If they couldn't resolve the breach, the message to the world would be devastating, that the United States was vulnerable. 2 catastrophic hacks in just 7 weeks was already a nightmare scenario. What they needed now wasn't just a breakthrough, they needed someone to take the fall. At the Attorney General's office, NSA and FBI reps sat around the table, waiting for one thing: a search warrant for a man in Glen Burnie, Maryland, just outside Baltimore. Only hours earlier, the NSA had flagged something strange, a cryptic tweet from an account called 9999999. Its bio read, "Mer working to mature capabilities, Camry, French for long live death, long live war, long live this sacred mercenary." The account linked to a YouTube clip of a Blackwater sniper killing 100 insurgents, posted 13 years ago. The tweet itself was gone, but whatever it said had set off alarms at the highest levels of US intelligence. The man behind it was Harold T. Martin III. On paper, Harold fit the rogue agent profile perfectly. A former Navy man, he'd left in 1992 for a string of tech jobs as a government contractor, mainly for Booz Allen Hamilton, the same private intelligence giant that once employed Edward Snowden. Through Booz Allen, he moved between assignments there and at the NSA, working with tailored access operations, better known as the Equation Group, the exact group the shadow brokers had hit. To the FBI and NSA, that was enough. Loretta Lynch didn't need more proof, to be sure. With a signature and a stamp, the warrant was signed. Dawn breaks in Maryland. The street outside is locked down tight. Black SUVs and armored trucks idle in formation, sealing off every exit. One by one, agents step out, faces hidden behind balaclavas, bodies wrapped in heavy tactical vests, marked in bold letters, SWAT. Each carries a Heckler & Koch MP5 held low but ready. Inside, Harold T. Martin III moves through his morning, unaware that his house is now a target. Outside, the team leader raises a gloved hand and gives the signal. Flashbangs crack the air, blinding light, deafening sound, followed by the splinter of a front door ripped from its hinges. The agents flood in, voices booming commands as they clear each room in seconds. Minutes later, Harold is on the floor, wrists bound, the morning silence gone. Inside Martin's home, and even through the windows of his parked car, the scene is almost surreal. Piles of classified material are everywhere. In total, 50 terabytes of the most sensitive data in existence, some of it dating back 2 full decades. Among the files are documents so restricted they're marked Need to Know Only, the kind reserved for a tiny circle inside the intelligence world. Yet here they are, unsecured, sitting in boxes and binders like forgotten homework. The stash spans nearly every 3-letter agency in Washington: CIA, NSA, US Cyber Command, the Department of Defense, and the National Reconnaissance Office. And this wasn't a one-time grab. Martin had been quietly taking material for over 20 years. For the FBI, it's the jackpot. Not just a potential scapegoat, maybe even the very man who leaked the NSA's crown jewels. Once Harold T. Martin III is in custody, he's moved under heavy guard to a secure federal facility. The interrogation is about to begin. For 2 full months, nothing. No leaks, no cryptic posts, just silence. It felt like the chaos had burned out, but on October 15, 2016, the Shadow Brokers reappeared and lit another fuse. The Shadow Brokers is deciding to leak the Bill Clinton-Loretta Lynch airplane conversation. But first, the Shadow Brokers is having another announcement. The Shadow Brokers is being bored with auctions, so no more auctions. Auction off, the auction finished, auction done, no winners. So, who wants a password? The Shadow Brokers publicly posted the password when receiving 10,000 Bitcoin. Same Bitcoin address, same file. Password is crowdfunding, sharing risk, sharing reward. Everyone is winning. And now, the Shadow Brokers is presenting the Bill Clinton and Loretta Lynch Arizona airplane conversation. Be enjoying yourself. For the first time, they directly addressed their failed auction, dropping the price to 10,000 Bitcoin, a far cry from the original 1 million. But then the message swerved into something stranger. An alleged 2006 meeting between former President Bill Clinton and Attorney General Loretta Lynch. Yes, the same Lynch who signed off on the search warrant. From there, the post spiraled into lurid detail about what supposedly happened on that plane. We're not going to repeat it here, but let's just say it was less cybersecurity briefing and more bad tabloid fiction. No files were released this time, but the post made 2 things obvious. The Shadow Brokers were still out there, and Harold Martin, the man sitting in FBI custody, couldn't possibly be behind these updates. He was already locked away. But a few months later, the game would change again, permanently. Election night 2016. Networks call it Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States. At first, he's viewed as friendly toward Russia, and by extension toward the Shadow Brokers. But by April, that perception takes a sharp turn. My fellow Americans, a short time ago I ordered the United States Armed Forces to launch precision strikes on targets associated with the chemical weapons capabilities of Syrian dictator Bashar al-Assad. With those words, Trump announces a military strike on Syria, a close ally of Russia. In hitting Syria, he's indirectly hitting Russia. For the Shadow Brokers, this is betrayal. Their response comes almost instantly. A new post on Medium titled "Don't Forget Your Base." It's their biggest leak yet, and the last one they will ever release. Dear President Trump, respectfully, what are you doing? The Shadow Brokers voted for you. The Shadow Brokers support you. The Shadow Brokers are losing faith in you, Mr. Trump. Helping the Shadow Brokers help you is abandoning your base, the movement, and the peoples who are getting you elected. The people who voted for you voted against the Republican Party, the party that tried to destroy your character in the primaries. The people who voted for you voted against the Democrat Party, the party that hates, mocks, and laughs at you. Without the support of the people who voted for you, what do you think will be happening to your presidency? Without the support of the people who voted for you, do you think you'll still be making America great again? The shadow brokers don't want this to be happening to you, Mr. Trump. The shadow brokers want to see you succeed. The shadow brokers want America to be great again. Mr. Trump, whose war are you fighting? Israeli nationalists, Zionists, and Goldman Sachs' war? You haven't been in office 3 months and already you look like the MIs. With John McCain and Chuck Schumer double Dutch riding each other in the corner over dead corpses. This time, the shadow brokers weren't just mocking. They were speaking directly to US leadership. Their anger was aimed at Trump's decision to bomb Syria and remove Steve Bannon from the National Security Council. They accused him of siding with bankers, globalists, and the military-industrial complex instead of the movement that got him elected. And then came the real hit. At the end of the message, they posted the password to decrypt almost their entire stolen archive. Most of the NSA tools they had taken were now available to anyone, anywhere, completely free. This wasn't about money anymore, it was defiance. A final act of rebellion against the US government. For the FBI, it wasn't just a leak, it was a full-scale cyber-terrorist attack, one of the first of its kind, and they were going to treat it that way. Inside the shadow broker's dump were 67 Windows executables, zero-day exploits, IP addresses, drivers, Trojan horses, an entire digital armory forged by the Equation Group. Some of it was old, patched months or years earlier, but some of it was unlike anything the public had ever seen. One exploit in particular stood out to digital forensics experts: the ability to edit Windows event logs, not just delete them. That's a holy grail in the cyber world. Event logs are treated like sacred evidence in investigations. You can clear them entirely, sure, but surgically altering them without leaving a trace? That's supposed to be impossible. It was a trick reserved for the NSA's most trusted hands. Now, it was out in the wild, but none of that compared to the crown jewel, Eternal Blue. Eternal Blue exploited a flaw in SMB-v1, a Windows protocol installed by default on almost every machine. Officially labeled CVE 2017-0144, the bug let attackers send specially crafted packets to the SMB-v1 server and remotely execute any code they wanted. Under the hood, it chained together 3 separate issues, including a mathematical error that caused a buffer overflow and memory allocation problems, allowing total system control. In plain English, with Eternal Blue, a hacker could break into millions of Windows computers across the globe without ever touching them physically. This wasn't just a powerful tool, it was a turning point. Eternal Blue was the biggest, most dangerous exploit in the leak, and overnight, it had gone from a tightly guarded NSA weapon to a free download for anyone with an internet connection. May 2017. Just a month after Eternal Blue was unleashed into the wild, the world got a taste of what that kind of power looked like in the wrong hands. The result, WannaCry. In a matter of hours, the ransomware tore through networks across the globe. Over 200,000 computers are locked up in 150 countries. Hospitals froze, surgeries stopped mid-schedule, ambulances were rerouted. For many experts, this wasn't just another cyber incident. It was the largest coordinated attack in the history of the internet. WannaCry's weapon of choice? Eternal Blue. Using it, the malware spread like wildfire, eventually infecting more than 300,000 systems worldwide. Microsoft pushed out emergency patches to close the SMBv1 hole, but for countless organizations running outdated systems or never installing updates, the damage was already done. The cost? Billions in losses. Governments, banks, transportation networks, no sector was safe. Even the world's largest chipmaker, TSMC, had to shut down production lines, bleeding millions by the hour. The scale was so severe that the White House took the unusual step of going public. This was a careless and reckless attack. It affected individuals, industry, governments, and the consequences were beyond economic. The computers affected badly in the UK, and their healthcare system put lives at risk, not just money. After careful investigation, the United States is publicly attributing the massive WannaCry cyber attack to North Korea. We do not make this allegation lightly. We do so with evidence, and we do so with partners. For all its tools and tricks, Eternal Blue might be remembered less for its engineering genius, and more for the chaos it unleashed. With their last file dump, the shadow brokers simply disappeared. No more taunts, no more auctions, no more cryptic rants. That final post was their mic drop, and the silence since has been absolute. Meanwhile, Harold T. Martin III faced the consequences. He pled guilty, earning 9 years in federal prison, plus 3 years of supervised release and a $250,000 fine. Yet, despite the FBI's early confidence, No concrete evidence ever tied him to the shadow brokers. In fact, investigators concluded he had never accessed the stolen NSA files outside of secure government facilities. The bulk of his charges came from hoarding decades' worth of classified documents in his home, material from agencies ranging from the NSA to the CIA, Cyber Command, the Department of Defense, and even the National Reconnaissance Office. The case was further clouded when many of his statements were thrown out after a judge ruled the FBI hadn't given him a proper Miranda warning during initial questioning. But here's the uncomfortable truth. While Eternal Blue may have caused billions in global damages, it wasn't the shadow brokers who built it. It came from the NSA, a taxpayer-funded weapon, developed in secret, and then lost in one of the most embarrassing breaches in US intelligence history. So the question lingers, who's really to blame? To this day, no one knows who the shadow brokers are. Russia? North Korea? An American insider? Someone else entirely? What's certain is that they pulled off one of the most impactful hacks in history, releasing NSA-grade cyber weapons into the wild and changing the digital battlefield forever. They've surfaced a few times since, small ripples, nothing like the tidal waves of their early days, but for now they stay true to their name. Hidden, watching. A reminder that even the most fortified systems can be cracked wide open.